We're going to move on to the next section of the discussion today. TGR has done such a great job at setting the stage, as did Danielle, about why this issue is important and how partnerships can be transformative in helping to shape really optimal outcomes. But as we often do at STEMconnector, we like to kind of start with everybody's the conversation being grounded in data. I heard a joke on the radio recently that what is the plural of anecdotes? Not data. And it's really important that we ground ourselves in, I'm sure everybody's hysterically laughing, that it's very important that we ground ourselves in the reality, and that we talk about, understanding what is the situation and not just anecdotal evidence. I think that the challenge with some of these issues, particularly as they relate to equity in education, is that anecdotes often drive agendas. And I think we want to focus on understanding data, understanding what works, and I think that will help us advance to more equity in education. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my outstanding colleague, Abby Myers of STEMconnector. And Abby is works in our product development and research department at STEMconnector. She recently published an amazing paper that we will leave in the Dropbox that's available around upskilling and reskilling, and has also been working on a series, a collection of data series focusing on overlooked talent pools. So she's going to share some insights around equity in STEM with you that will hopefully inform our subsequent discussions moving forward today. So I'm going to pass it to you, Abby.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Ted. And can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slides here. Wonderful. Thank you again so much for that very kind introduction, and welcome everyone. My name is Abby Myers. Again, I am the senior member of the research team here at STEMconnector. And in this segment of the program, I'll be providing us some grounding in the research, data, and definitions surrounding equity in STEM education. Before we dive into that data, I want to first take a moment to ground us in three key assumptions that underlie all of STEMconnector's research and resources. And for many of you, these next few slides may look very familiar. That's because these assumptions were established in STEMconnector's signature research piece, State of STEM, which remains an evergreen framework for the foundation for defining the STEM landscape. The first of these three assumptions is that it's not a single actor, but rather a STEM talent ecosystem. When we think about the STEM talent crisis and the steps needed to address it, we know that there is no one organization or one sector responsible for solving it. Instead, it takes all actors in the ecosystem working together. State of STEM identified three subsystems, which we also refer to as sectors or ages and stages: the K12 subsystem, the post-secondary subsystem, and the employer subsystem. In addition to these three subsystems, we know that a variety of external factors also play a role in influencing STEM outcomes. These include technology, policy, media, and the macroeconomy. And I can think of no better example of how these external forces can really make an impact than in 2020, where during this global pandemic, for instance, it's pushed technology and policy into the forefront of conversations around education. The K12 sector, the focus of today's Innovation Lab, is crucially important to the overall STEM ecosystem. The data shows that when students leave these educational years with a strong foundation in STEM, they are more likely to enter, persist, and ultimately succeed in STEM post-secondary pathways and careers. The second assumption is that it's not just one simple gap, but rather 5 nuanced STEM talent gaps. Arguably, the more research we do on the STEM talent crisis, the more complex the problem reveals itself to be. One way to start to wrap our heads around this complexity is to acknowledge that there are multiple gaps across multiple parts of the STEM talent ecosystem. The way we at STEMconnector approach these multiple perspectives is through the lens of the 5 STEM talent gaps, starting with the fundamental skills gap, where industry and education have both identified skills that young people need to succeed, not just in STEM-specific career pathways, but as well-rounded, lifelong workers and active citizens. Unfortunately, we know from the data that not enough young people are developing these foundational skills to meet the needs of a rapidly changing world. The belief gap, where young people and the adults around them hold incorrect beliefs about the aptitude and traits people must have to belong and thrive in STEM fields. The post-secondary education gap, which acknowledges that a new and ever-accelerating knowledge economy requires credentials beyond a high school diploma, yet not enough individuals are earning those credentials or the specialized skills that accompany them. The geographic gap, where hubs of economic growth, particularly for businesses requiring STEM skills, are often concentrated in a handful of areas and located far away from qualified job seekers. And finally, the demographic gap, which acknowledges the persistent, disproportionate participation in STEM based on race, gender, income, or other demographic factors. The third and final assumption is that it's not just one solution, but rather many solution sets at scale. We know the problem is complex. We know that inequities persist, and we know that it will take more than one actor, more than one sector, and more than one solution to tackle it. It requires targeting each step on the pathway, taking special care to support those who are under-resourced and underrepresented, and most importantly, to do it together. It's through our collective action that we can make a real impact. With these common assumptions in mind, I also want to ground us in a common understanding of what equity in K-12 STEM education should look like. And to do that, I'm going to borrow a couple of definitions. The first definition comes from the Aspen Institute and the Council of Chief State School Officers. It says that educational equity means that every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, family background, and family income. I'd also like to share a second complementary definition, this one from UNESCO, where we acknowledge that an equitable approach to education recognizes that some people, because of an accident of birth or circumstance, need more help than others to achieve their goals in life. With these shared understandings in mind, let's take a look at just a small selection of the data available to us that shows where some of the inequities exist in K-12 education. To start, let's take a look at test scores. Oh, excuse me, there's our second definition right there. While standardized test scores are perhaps an imperfect measure, they can be a helpful one, especially as we look at progress over time. Over the next several slides, we are going to look at one particular standardized test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the largest nationally representative assessment of subject matter proficiency among students in the US. In addition, we're going to be focusing on math proficiency scores and comparing the scores of different groups of students. Throughout the next few slides, you will continue to see this gray dotted line, which represents the share of 8th grade students who scored proficient or above in math, which was at 34% in 2019. Already, we see an opportunity for improvement here, with only about 1 out of 3 students testing at a proficient level. However, when we start looking at these proficiency levels between different groups of students, other stories emerge. Let's start by looking at scores by gender. So what may or may not come as a surprise is that male and female 8th grade students score very similarly in math, 34% versus 33% in 2019. The reason I say this might be surprising is because if you looked at the share of men versus women earning math or engineering post-secondary degrees, you'd think there'd have to be some discrepancy. But again, test scores are just one metric we can look at to understand where these inequities lie, which we'll revisit the topic of gender in just a short while. Let's take a look at another group of students, this time by where their school is located. Among students living in rural versus urban areas, we start to see some differences. Suburban schools, which correlate with higher income neighborhoods and thus more school funding, see students scoring higher in math compared to their peers in city schools by about 10 percentage points. Meanwhile, students from schools located in rural areas or towns perform somewhere in the middle. Again, you might be surprised to learn that students in rural communities are performing just as well, if not better, than some of their peers, because rural areas are often associated with lower income families, fewer resources, and less connectivity. Again, we'll revisit some of these ideas in just a bit. Let's look now at scores by race and ethnicity. Here, we start to see a story that unfortunately will become quite familiar. White and Asian students perform well above the average, while traditionally underrepresented groups in STEM, such as Black, Hispanic, and Native students, fall behind. The gap we see here between these groups with the highest scores and the lowest hasn't narrowed over time. In fact, it's gotten wider. And then when we start to look at some other groups, such as students with disabilities compared to students with no reported disabilities, this gap gets even wider. It gets even wider when we start to look at students who are English language learners versus those who are English proficient. When we look at the data in this way, we start to get a picture of the students we're leaving behind. But again, this is just one metric from one age group from one standardized test. To get more of a complete story, we need to look at other measures too. So let's take a look at access. Here, we have the percentage of students attending high schools with a full range of math and science courses offered. So that would include high-level classes like AP Biology, Calculus, etc. When we group these percentages by race, as seen here, we see a very similar story to the one we saw with math test scores. 81% of Asian students and 71% of white students in the US having access to those high-level courses, while closer to half of Black and Native students having that access. When we look at the same topic by school location, students who attend schools in rural areas across the board are less likely to have access to those advanced math and science courses compared to students in non-rural schools. We know from just a few slides ago that this is not a matter of those students in rural areas being less proficient in math, but rather they simply don't always have the option to take those courses like calculus. Let's take a look at one more type of measure, and that's student interest. We know from the research that student-reported interest in STEM subjects such as math and science correlate with those students entering into STEM degree programs later on. Here, we have the share of high school seniors that agree with the following statements. I like science, and I would like a job that involves using science. The same story emerges. White and Asian students being more likely than their Hispanic and Black peers to be interested in pursuing STEM. So much of this discrepancy goes back to that lack of access, but also to a lack of role models, mentors, and social networks that can inspire those students to pursue STEM. The underrepresentation of these groups in STEM careers affects the students who don't see very many people, if anyone, who looks like them working in STEM. It also speaks to the belief gap, where students who do not feel welcomed and included in math and science classrooms are less likely to envision themselves in math and science jobs. When we look at similar questions posed to both male and female students, we start to see where some of the gender inequities lie, with female students being less likely than their male peers to report liking science, liking math, liking their STEM courses, and wanting to pursue STEM careers. Again, creating cultures of inclusion that welcome students from all backgrounds matters for closing these gaps. Finally, I want to call attention to a set of inequities that has become all too important recently, and that is the digital divide. In 2020, roughly 1 in 3 students lack adequate access to internet or devices needed in order to conduct distance learning. This lack of connectivity works to exacerbate the inequities that persisted long before this global pandemic, with Hispanic, Black, and Native students being far less connected than their white peers, and with rural students having far less access than urban and suburban students. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to end this data presentation without addressing the multitude of additional factors affecting equitable K-12 education, from the lack of racial diversity among K-12 educators, lack of universal access to early childhood education, lack of access to after-school programs and informal learning opportunities, to how issues like poverty, food insecurity, and childhood trauma affect learning outcomes. There is simply not enough time to give each one its due. But going back to our 3 assumptions, we know that we are not lone actors, but rather part of an ecosystem. We know that the problem is complex, consisting of more than one type of gap, and we know that it won't take one solution, but rather many solutions at scale. Together, we can start to learn, to understand, and to work towards building a more diverse, sustainable, and equitable STEM ecosystem. For more information, I invite all of you to engage with our research and resources, which includes our evergreen frameworks, our deep dives into individual solution sets, and our data assets and analyses. This year, we have a new series called Overlooked Talent Pools, which takes a deep dive into the data and research around specific demographic groups in STEM. Already available on our website are the Black and African American, rural resident, and military veteran stories. And in September, we'll be releasing the next installment on Hispanics and Latinx in STEM. In addition, we have several upcoming opportunities to engage with STEMconnector's research and products through the STEMconnector Annual Summit, which will be held virtually on September 18th, and Walmart's National Day of Design, which will be available for free on our website throughout the month of October. This year's mission, called Virtual Voyagers, provides opportunities for students to design and innovate solutions that allow them to collaborate safely online. In light of the fact that many students are learning virtually this year, the Day of Design missions can be adapted for students and parents to do from home or over the internet. Thank you all so much, and with that, I will turn it back over to Ted.